Hey everyone, we are in conversation with Andrew Barnes, who is the co-founder and CEO of GoOne.com, one of the world's largest onboarding, compliance, and professional development platforms. Andrew's a really smart dude. Rhodes Scholar, Master's in Science and Education from Oxford University, PhD in Business Strategy from Queensland University, right there in Brisbane, Australia. Andrew, welcome to the show In Conversation With. It's so good to have you here. Now, let's go back a bit in time. It's 2015. You and your co-founder are thinking about GoOne. You're thinking about education. You're thinking about, technology. And then you're thinking about the end user, the learner, the employee, the team member. I'm curious for you to hear from you. Sorry, what was kind of the missing link? We're getting close to a decade ago, but what was the missing link with respect to kind of the education, technology, learning space, and why did you feel compelled to fill it?
Yeah, and it's great to be here, Dan. So back in 2015, there were four of us, myself and three other co-founders, and we'd had sort of different experiences, I suppose, that we realized when we were sort of sharing them and talking through them, that there was a common core to it, and that sort of then gave rise to the idea around GoOne. And that common core, maybe to sort of run through some of those experiences. One of the co-founders is a medical doctor. And so as part of finishing up medical school, would do a rotation through different hospitals, and they would change every sort of 2 to 3 months the hospital that they were working at. And as you would imagine, in sort of a healthcare setting, there's a lot of important training that needs to be done. But for the first 2 or 3 days, of doing a new hospital rotation, Vu, who is a medical doctor, would have to sit down at a computer at the hospital and repeat compliance training that they'd done just 2 months ago. Things like hand washing training and other things, which are super important, but if you're competent in them, maybe need to be refreshed once every 24 months, not every 2 months. And it was because the hospital systems couldn't share training records or learning records between each other. Another of the co-founders was working with the United Nations, and I suppose had this idealistic view that surely an organization as large as the UN would have their internal sort of L&D and training sorted, and they did not.
Whoopsies. Yeah, right.
That's it. And so when we're sort of talking through this, and as you're mentioning, I was doing an MSc studying education, we thought actually there's an opportunity to do something different here. And if you sort of think of the world of corporate education, typically people think of content creators or sort of the software systems out there that develop that you can sort of do training within. And we thought, actually, we'll do something different. We'll just be the glue that connects both of those together. So licensing hundreds and thousands of different sort of content creators and making it then easily available to organizations and their end users across different systems. So if you do complete training at organization A, organization B can see that you don't need to sort of sit down for 2 to 3 days as you sort of start a new role. All those training completions can be shared. And if you're working at a big organization or a small organization, you can have a great access to a diverse range of skills and topics to learn from.
So interestingly, as the recovering chief learning officer that I call myself from time to time, one of my biggest nigglers, I suppose, was that the LMS trapped education, and the LMS was almost beholden to whatever content you could throw in it. And then, once you ended up saying, wait a second, what can I transfer that somewhere else? Or can I bring in, content from elsewhere without having to, it be a SCORM course or AICC course or what have you? It just sort of almost was impossible. So in if you don't mind, in layman's terms, what's content aggregation? And sort of, I believe that, GoOne is that, as you say, glue that binds the book together. But how does it work, I suppose, and what's the benefit to both the organization and maybe even end users, people like me?
Yeah, so the exact problem that you were just describing is exactly what we address. And so the idea that as an individual within an organization, as a HR or L&D leader wanting to sort of train a team, we want to make it really easy to learn in all the different areas that make sense. So whether it's in the corporate LMS, and that might be SuccessFactors or Oracle or Workday or Cornerstone or Docebo or Degreed, whether it's an LMS or an LXP, or it could be within your HRIS, or increasingly what we're seeing is individuals and organizations wanting to learn within Teams, Slack, Workplace, or within their CRM. We might be using Salesforce, and wouldn't it be great to be able to learn in the flow of work in that regard? So what we do is we just make sure the content that an organization wants to access, and again, it could be in all the wonderful different formats that you described, SCORM, AICC, XAPI, LTI, could be a video file, it could be a document, whatever it is, we normalize it and make it available in all of those platforms. And so if you start doing some training, say in Microsoft Teams, and then you go into the LMS, you can continue doing it there. And the way we sort of think of it internally is it doesn't matter what system you're accessing. And imagine you go out and you buy a new television. It could be a Samsung, a Sony, an LG TV, it doesn't really matter. Chances are it'll have a Netflix button. And if you start watching that show on Netflix on your TV, and then you go and you continue on your mobile phone or your tablet, picks up where you left off, that horizontal layer of content is exactly what we focus on. So we make sure whatever the format it plays and whatever the end application, all the content's there.
So would you consider Go1 more invisible thus to the end user, and however your main target customer would be the CHRO, CLO, the executive that needs a more formidable way, if you will, to ensure that the content has connections to other content repositories?
We don't have an ego around brand, but we think it's important that when people are accessing content, they know it's something that we're powering, because those learning records that we're sort of speaking about, our view is that they fundamentally belong to the individual, the learner. And so for that individual, you might be working within sort of large enterprise, doing some training, but if you then move on to a different firm, how do you have access to that? And by virtue of using Go1, that individual does, and equally that value proposition to the CHRO or the L&D leader, we can sort of unlock access to hundreds of thousands of great pieces of content. So if you sort of think of Netflix or Spotify, the great things about those platforms really is the content, and the same is true for us. So if you're using Go1, the reason you're doing that is because you can access Harvard Managed Mentor or Skillsoft or Coursera or Blinkist or some fantastic providers. And so that's the core value proposition, but you still know you're using Spotify, Netflix to get access to the great content.
So you brought up a good point there, right? So that is, what are your competitors, I suppose, and who are your co-opetors, and then who, frankly, do you partner with so that it's a seamless experience? So you mentioned the Coursera's, you got the Udemy's, you've got where content lives and people can go in and take it on an end user license. Their company may have an organizational license, LinkedIn Learning, for example, right? And then you've got other, I guess, collaborators perhaps in the space. So the Gloats, the Degreeds, right? Some of the other glues that are out there. And then you've got Thinkifics, and you've got people who create content in a learning space, or allow you perhaps to be a content creator. So take us through all of that, if you will, and where does Go1 fit in the whole ecosystem? Yeah,
probably a great example is thinking about, you could be an organization using Degreed, and we've got lots of customers that use Degreed, and it's a fantastic platform, and you're looking to get access to content. And it could be Coursera, it could be edX, it could be Udemy, it could be Skillsoft, it could be any of sort of hundreds of other content creators. And we work with them. We've got partnerships with all those firms that I just mentioned. We can make that available within Degreed, and at the same time make that available within Teams and Slack and Workplace and other locations. So it probably comes across a little bit kitsch to sort of say that we sort of think the pie is big enough for everyone to share. We fundamentally see all of those players as really important partners in how do we help an organization and an end user get access to the best training that they possibly can.
Love it. Okay, so I'm an individual content creator. Let's say it's me. I'm an author. I have the want and the will, and maybe even the wherewithal to create leadership content for the masses. So what's your suggestion? What do I do? How does Go1 help me get my content out to the world then?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of content creator tools, but we also then work with, like, you might want to use Articulate or something to create the content. Will also allow you to import and embed content that you might have created elsewhere as well. So I think it really depends on what style of content you're looking to create. Is it a podcast? Is it sort of a video course? Is it something where you might have quizzes and assessments? Choosing the right tool that's going to help you do that. And then if you want access to our audience of millions of learners, then you can add that to our platform and control the sort of licensing and distribution of it to that audience. But yeah, fundamentally, the content creation tools, we want to make them as easy as possible, but definitely know that there's, again, a wide library of different options out there, and want to make it possible for people to author in whatever experience makes sense for them, and then add it to the library if they want to access the distribution that we can provide.
Love it. It's great, Andrew. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and think about the industry itself. So let me take you back to 2015. There's 4 of you. You're up and running, and 5 years later, you're up and running in a much more demonstrable way. Yet, as I like to say, Friday the 13th hit 7.5 billion people, and the pandemic hits. So what was it like between 2015 and 2020? From an industry perspective, from the growth of Go1, kind of what you saw. And then as the wheels fell off the proverbial Earth bus on Friday the 13th in March of 2020, what have you noticed over the past 2 years then from an industry perspective? We'll talk about learners and organizations. I'm talking about the learning industry specifically first.
Yeah, the sort of super interesting thing, at least when we look at it, is from a Go1 perspective first, is if you zoom out and you look at the sort of 7 years from 2015 through to today, we've doubled every single year. And so you'd sort of go, oh, well, it's pretty consistent, nothing changed. But when you zoom in, and I think this is sort of representative of the industry as a whole, in that sort of March, April, May period, we had customers sort of canceling contracts, nothing happening. It was the first time in our business that we went backwards. For a high growth business, you never go backwards. But I think what happened, as you're sort of describing, is the whole world changed overnight. Was, I suppose, a knee-jerk reaction around how do we sort of stop everything we're doing? How do we cut anything that we think is potentially discretionary? And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, they view training and investing in sort of learning and development as discretionary. And so that's certainly what we saw. And a couple of months go by, and I think people and organizations very quickly realize that, hey, maybe it's not as discretionary as we thought. Making sure that we can sort of help equip our teams to be successful is critically important. Let's invest in it. And even more so, let's sort of think about how do we train our teams in a world where a lot of people, like the vast majority of people, particularly early in the pandemic, forced to work at home, forced to sort of no longer be in an office environment. How do we sort of change all of those modes of engagement, where you might have had people fly to a conference or do some professional development in person or get a speaker in, all of that's sort of changing. So when you zoom out, it at least sort of seems pretty consistent, but I think there was this sort of spike where perhaps businesses saw L&D and training as something that was not essential, and then very quickly realized that no, it's in fact more essential than ever before.
It was a bit of a deer in headlights approach when a lot of CFOs got involved and started whacking, the quote training costs as opposed to the learning development and team member investment piece. So I completely understand and fully agree. If we go back to industry just for a second, because I do want to come back to organizations and people, but in industry, have you noticed anything specific to the last 2 years, whence upon the pandemic hit, where other education tech players are doubling down, new entrants that have come in that sort of are now nipping at your heels, or at least saying, hey, I see there's opportunity here in this, so-called learning investment space?
Yeah, there's certainly, I think, a lot of activity, and I think that was across the whole space. So focusing on corporate education, I think a lot of individuals had plenty of time on their hands. And so the likes of the individual sort of B2C course marketplaces like Udemy and Coursera took off.
Yeah.
Some of the tools that you were sort of describing for content creators, whether it's Thinkific or Kajabi or Teachable or whatnot, I think, again, people looking for income streams where they could sort of work from home and share their sort of knowledge with the world, they seem to sort of take off. And I think what we also saw is like everyone sort of, and we're on Zoom right now, everyone sort of knows the explosion that occurred with Zoom and Teams and video conferencing more broadly. I think there was a very similar thing when it came to, okay, how do we take a lot of in-person learning events and take them online? Mm-hmm. And so seeing virtual conferences, seeing a real focus, I suppose, on cohort-based learning, which is really interesting to sort of see labeled as this new thing. My wife's a primary school teacher, so I think she described cohort-based learning as something that's been around for quite a while, but perhaps in a corporate setting and in a digital setting, it's something that's new and exciting, and I think is a really important part of thinking about how do we learn as human beings. So all of those things I think have been really interesting to watch from an industry perspective and be involved in.
You're spot on, and God bless your wife, because, I think University of Bologna might have invented cohorts, which is just basically, a class of students learning together over a period of time. But, who am I to judge? When we look at the organizations and looking with your kind of crystal ball gazing hat on for a second here, Andrew, what do you see happening, if you will, over the next couple of years or so? Are organizations now in a more comfortable spot then to say, yeah, you know what, the way we used to do it was pretty dumb, with whether it's just the LMS or maybe the LMS and all, face-to-face kind of get your butts in a seat type of model. Tell us a bit about how you see things playing out over the next few years from the vantage point of, your Go One lens, but just maybe the industry itself.
Yeah. I wish I had a crystal ball, sort of dust it off and peer into it. Probably my best guess is that it'll just continue to evolve, and sort of sounds like a non-answer, but if you sort of think of it, and certainly when I talk to chief learning officers or L&D leaders, HR leaders, CEOs, CFOs, there's, I suppose, an intuitive awareness that we have as society that education is important. And there's an awareness that, particularly within a workplace setting, investing in your people is important. Like I said, sometimes there's sort of different acute events that make people sort of knee jerk away from that for a period of time. But I think people come back to, no, we need to invest in our people for a variety of reasons. How do we sort of ensure our team are more productive and able to sort of do more, but also how do we attract and retain talent as a really important part of why we as organizations invest in people. But I think there's still a real difficulty in measuring ROI beyond that. There's this intuitive understanding that we have that training is important. And there's some broad sort of statistics that particularly larger organizations can look to sort of see the impact of training. But if you're a small business with 50, 100, 200 team members, there's not that science around it. And so I think one of the things that I would suggest as a bit of a prediction for the next couple of years. So I think technology is getting to the point where we can start seeing that impact a little bit more clearly, and perhaps being a little bit more specific and targeted in how we approach education. And so the opportunity, rather than sort of do a sort of a mass broadcast from one person to sort of 1,000 people in a lecture theatre, or everyone sort of engaged in the same curriculum, I think there's an opportunity to tailor it much more to the individual, and then to see that translate through to higher impact, higher ROI, however an organization wants to sort of measure and quantify that.
Andrew, I love the idea of bespoke learning. You and I can call it that going forward. We'll go into business and come up with bespoke learning, because I think that's exactly what you're on about. When we have the opportunity to tailor education to the needs of the employee/learner, such that it's not, a mass broadcast, such that it's very targeted, because as we all know, time is the new oil. It's the new currency, and we need to be more efficient yet effective with our time. So I think you are spot on with that analysis.
And the roles and skills and experiences that we each bring to bear are very different and they're very heterogeneous. So you could pick any organization, like you can imagine, say a hospital, and you go, okay, well, that seems to be a pretty simple business. That'd be a bunch of healthcare workers, but no, hospital employees, obviously some medical staff, nursing staff, they've got receptionists, they've got IT admins, they've got accountants, they've got a whole set of roles where the learning journeys are going to be very different compared to each other. The sort of finance team are going to need to be equipped with very different skills to the nursing team. And so, yeah, it becomes sort of super intuitive when you take sort of an example like that. And I think the ability to tailor training much more specifically to each of those individuals is going to be something that I think we'll increasingly see.
Sounds a lot like we're stealing a page from your wife and what we've got to do inside a classroom for primary school kids as well, right? It's very tailored and making sure that you address the needs of the kids. So why don't we just take that great model and maybe use it for adults? Sounds like a good idea, no?
Simple.
Listen, it's been great to catch up with you, learn a lot more about your thoughts, your leadership, and certainly Go One. Where it might be obvious, but where can people find more about the organization and what you do?
Yeah, our website, as you mentioned, is go1.com. So go, then the digit one.com. And that's probably the best place to find out more.
Andrew, it's a pleasure, everyone. This is Andrew Barnes. He's the co-founder and CEO of Go One. Lovely to speak with you. Thanks again. And best of luck as you grow for the next several years.
Thank you, Dan.